Welcome to BeFM Drama, where we turn great literature into gripping radio. I'm your host, Joshua Cornwell, and tonight we're presenting part 2 in our 5-part adaptation of The Harpooned Man, a classic Sherlock Holmes mystery. In this episode, Hopkins, a promising young police inspector, is relaying the details of the death of Peter Carey, a fearsome former sea captain with a deadly drunken temper. As we rejoin the story, Hopkins arrives at the point in his narrative when he discovers the man's body. Inspector Hopkins took a deep breath before relating his tale, clearly disturbed by what he had seen in Peter Carey's cabin. The inspector had fairly steady nerves, but he was shaken when he put his head into that little shack. There was a deep, droning buzz from all the flies, and the floor and walls looked like the interior of a slaughterhouse. He had never seen so much blood. Carey had called his shack a cabin, and so it was. There was a bunk on one end, a sea chest, maps and navigation charts, a photograph of the sea unicorn, logbooks on the shelf, exactly as you'd find in a captain's cabin at sea. And there, in the center, was the man himself, his twisted face like a lost soul's in torment, his great beard jutting upwards in agony. He was speared straight through his broad chest by a steel harpoon, which had sunk deeply into the wood of the wall behind him, pinning him like a beetle on a collector's card paper. Of course he was quite dead, and had been from the instant he had uttered that last horrible yell of agony at 1 o'clock the night before. Hopkins shook his head at the memory.
I know your methods, sir, and I applied them. Before I permitted anything to be moved, I carefully investigated the ground outside and also the floor of the room. There were no footmarks.
Meaning that you saw none?
I assure you, sir, there were none.
My good Hopkins, I've investigated many crimes, but I've never seen one committed by a flying creature. If a criminal stands on 2 legs, then there must be some indentation, abrasion, or displacement. It is incredible that this blood-spattered room contained no traces that could have aided the investigators. I understand, however, that there were a few details that you did not overlook.
The young inspector winced at my companion's ironical comments.
I was a fool not to call you in immediately, Mr. Holmes. Yes, there were several objects in the room that called for special attention. One was the harpoon. It had been pulled from a rack on the wall. 2 more harpoons were stored there, with a vacant place for the third. SSC Unicorn Dundee was engraved on the handle. This seemed to prove the crime had been done in a sudden moment of fury, and that the murderer had grabbed the first weapon he saw. Peter Carey was fully dressed, despite the fact that the crime was committed after 1 in the morning, suggesting that he had an appointment with the murderer. This is supported by the fact that a bottle of rum and 2 dirty glasses were still on the table in front of the body.
Yes, I think that's well supported. Was there any alcohol other than rum in the room?
Yes, there was brandy and whiskey in the sea chest. It is of no importance to us, however, since the decanters were full and had not been used.
The presence of other alcohol does have some significance, but never mind. Tell me some more about the objects in the room that seemed important to the case.
There was a tobacco pouch upon the table.
What part of the table?
In the center. It was made of coarse sealskin, and the initials PC were written on the inside flap. There was a ½ ounce of strong ship's tobacco inside.
Excellent. What else?
Stanley Hopkins pulled a drab notebook from his pocket. The outside was rough and worn, the pages discolored. The initials JHN were written on the first page, along with the date 1883. Holmes set the notebook on the table and examined it in his careful way, while Hopkins and I watched over his shoulders. On the second page, the letters CPR were printed, followed by several pages of numbers. One heading was Argentina, another Costa Rica, and another Sao Paulo, each with pages of numbers following after it.
What do you make of these?
They appeared to be lists of stock exchange securities. I thought that JHN were the initials of a broker, and that CPR might have been his client.
No, it stands for Canadian Pacific Railway.
Stanley Hopkins swore softly between his teeth and slapped his thigh.
I've been a fool. Of course you're right. Then JHN are the only initials we have to solve. I've examined the old stock exchange lists, but I can't find anyone in 1883 with these initials. But I feel that the clue is the most important one I have. You must admit, Mr. Holmes, that these initials might be those of the second person there that night in the cabin, the murderer. Also, the presence of a document listing many valuable securities at the crime scene may help us point towards a motive for the murder.
Sherlock Holmes's face showed that he was thoroughly taken aback by this new development.
I must say that this notebook, which did not appear in the inquest, changes many of my assumptions about the case. I had developed a theory, but there's no place in it for this new information. Have you traced any of the securities listed in this notebook?
Inquiries are now being made, but I fear it will take several weeks for a full register of stockholders of these South American companies to be developed, and several more weeks before we can trace the individual shares.
Holmes was examining the cover of the notebook with his magnifying glass.
There's some discoloration here.
Yes, sir, it is blood. I told you that I picked the book up off the floor.
Was the blood stain above it or below it?
On the side.
Which proves that the book was dropped after the crime was committed.
Exactly, Mr. Holmes. I understand that point, and thought it might have been dropped by the murderer as he rushed to escape. It lay near the door.
I suppose none of these securities have been found among the property of the murdered man?
No, sir.
Do you have any reason to suspect robbery?
No, sir. Nothing else seemed to have been touched.
Dear me, it is a very interesting case. What about the knife? There was a knife, wasn't there?
Yes, a hunting knife, still in its sheath. It lay at the feet of the dead man. Mrs. Carey has identified it as her husband's.
Holmes was lost in thought for some time.
Well, I suppose I shall have to come out and look at the crime scene.
Stanley Hopkins gave a cry of joy.
Thank you, sir. That would be a weight off my mind.
Holmes shook his finger at the inspector.
It would have been much easier a week ago, but even now my visit may not be entirely useless, Watson. If you can spare the time, I would be very glad of your company. Call a four-wheeler, Hopkins. My friend and I shall be ready to leave for Forest Row in a quarter of an hour.
Several hours later, we exited the train at the small wayside station and drove for some miles through the remnants of wide woods, which were once a part of the great forest that had for so long provided refuge from the Saxon invaders of England, the impenetrable Weald. For 60 years, the core of British industry. Vast areas of the forest had been cleared away, as this was the seat of the first ironworks of the country, and the trees were felled to smelt the ore. Now the industry had shifted north, leaving nothing but ravaged groves and great scars in the earth to show the work of the past. Here, in a clearing upon the green slope of a hill, stood a long, low stone house, approached by a curving drive running through the fields. Nearer the road, and surrounded on three sides by bushes, was a small outhouse, one window and the door facing in our direction. This was the scene of the murder. With that, we've come to the end of Part 2 in our 5-part adaptation of The Harpooned Man, here on BeFM Drama. What will Holmes be able to discover at the gruesome crime scene as he picks up the investigation a full week after the murder first took place? Find out tomorrow on the next exciting episode of BeFM Drama. From our studio in Busan, this is your host, Joshua Cornwell, signing off.